what she's done and where she's been. What I want to tell you about Margaret is what I admire about her, and that is, and hopefully prime her to, if she hasn't put this in her slides, to maybe talk about it or prime you to ask questions about it, because I think she probably has a perspective that many of you or all of you should find valuable, and that is, in addition to being a distinguished professional and having an MBA from Harvard and a master's degree in public policy from BYU, and working in the Harvard Business School, and running for office recently well, I'll let you tell her more about that if she wants to talk about it. Margaret is also a faithful Latter-day Saint and a good mom, and there's a whole part of our culture where we try to navigate those things, and it's an important thing not just for Latter-day Saint women to think about, but also Latter-day Saint men to think about. We all need to think about it because we get married and we have families, and how do you manage a family and a professional career? And there's lots of ways to do that, and lots of Latter-day Saints make different choices for different reasons, and I think Margaret has valuable perspective on that. And so at least having her say something about that at some point would be great, because I think we don't talk about it enough, and having people model that, or at least talk about it in ways that allow you to say, oh, I hadn't thought about those considerations, and especially having both men and women think about it. It's not just a question that women need to think about. We all need to think about it to make it work in a family. So anyway, without further ado, let's welcome Margaret Busse.
Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to be able to move around a little bit. Thank you for that introduction, Quinn. It's so nice to be here, and I love seeing Quinn again. We were great friends when we were, like Quinn said, when we were studying public policy here at BYU many years ago. So I will touch on what you talked about, Quinn. I'm going to cover hopefully lots of different things, and I would love to have a great discussion. Is it not working? That one's having a point, so we're going to switch it out here. Good. Trade off. Awesome. It's definitely on, isn't it? Okay, there we go. So hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. And I'd love to hear your questions. I'm thrilled to be back at BYU today. So let's see. So just some quick stats about me, just to kind of frame the conversation. I live in Acton, Massachusetts with my husband and 5 kids who I think are just walking in. They got to come to campus as well today. I graduated from BYU in 1996, so that seems like a long time ago, with a BA and MA in public policy and also a BA in economics. And then I graduated in 2001 with an MBA from Harvard Business School. And I currently work at Harvard Business School as the Associate Director of the Social Enterprise Initiative. And I recently ran as a candidate for the Massachusetts State Senate. Spoiler alert, I lost. So, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm really going to do kind of a 2-part presentation that I hope will be of interest to you. First is going to be this kind of nonlinear career path that I've had in the social sector. Social sector meaning kind of public sector and social enterprise and nonprofit type of organizations. Nonlinear because I took some time off to be a mom. And then I'll talk about my experience as a state Senate candidate in Massachusetts, specifically about political polarization that we see today happening and how it affected my campaign. I'm hoping that'll be of interest to you, given that I know you guys are all interested in taking courses in political science and international relations. So this question was asked to me by my husband, he had a missionary companion actually ask it of him. And the question was, what would you be if you were what you think about in the shower? Okay? What would you be if you were what you think about in the shower? Like, what would your career be when the things that your mind naturally goes to when you don't have to think about anything else, right? Kind of an interesting question. All right. So these are the two things that I think about a lot. I think about how do economic and political systems impact societies for good or for ill? And I think about what are the most effective ways to help people lead lives of dignity, purpose, and prosperity? So that's what I think about. I don't think about why the grass is green or why the sky is blue. My husband, as a scientist, and he thinks about those things. I don't think about those things as much, right? But it can be very illuminating to kind of think about what your mind naturally gravitates towards. And I'll talk about how answering those questions has really, in many ways, guided my career path. So I thought I'd start out with kind of a phase one, if you will, of my career. It's pretty linear. So I talked about being at BYU. While I was at BYU, I actually did a study abroad in Africa. We were in 3 different countries. It was the first of its kind from BYU. It was a little chaotic, but I came away from that experience just understanding how jarring the poverty that I witnessed there was. And I kind of came away a little depressed, to be honest, because it felt like a lot of the problems were intractable. But as a result, I took a lot of courses in economic development, international development, stumbled upon this newfangled idea at the time of microfinance. Some of you have heard of that, microfinance. So I ended up doing my thesis on microfinance in Africa. And I ended up actually going over to Mali for a time and helping to implement a village bank there. But after I graduated, I was a presidential management fellow, and I worked for the US Treasury Department. And within that job, this is sort of the second half of that job, I got to work for a place within the Treasury Department called the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. And so a microfinance institution, which makes, for those of you who don't know what they are, they make small loans to micro or very small entrepreneurs that don't otherwise have access to capital to fund their businesses. So a community development financial institution is an example, or a microfinance organization is an example of a CDFI, is the acronym. So I really enjoyed that. It was great. It was exactly what I wanted to be doing at that moment. But I realized while I was there that there wasn't a lot of good actual financial know-how at these organizations. Many of them had been started by do-gooders, which is great, people that maybe had degrees in social work or so forth, but they didn't actually have finance expertise or business expertise. So even though I had never thought about going to business school before, I decided I needed to go to business school. So I went to business school, and it was an absolutely phenomenal experience. I was very active in the Social Enterprise Club, which was a club for students that were interested in nonprofit sector, business with a social mission, public sector, those types of things. I actually did a summer internship with a microfinance organization, which was great. And then when I graduated, I had a great opportunity to go to a consulting firm, which was a spin-off of Bain. You guys know Bain, right? So Bain spun off a nonprofit consulting firm called the Bridgespan Group, which was trying to bring for-profit management principles to the nonprofit sector. So in that job capacity, I was able to get exposed to lots of different approaches by different organizations of how to help people achieve dignity, purpose, and prosperity. So I really enjoyed that. So you can see how all of this kind of makes sense, right? Then I had my first child. And you can see that things get a little off track after that. And I had 4 children within 6 years, and I had a 5th child about 4 years later. I didn't do any paid work for about 12 years. While I was in this mix over here, I guess I should use the pointer, this mix over here, I was doing all sorts of different things while I was taking care of little children. I was doing volunteer work with my children's schools. I was doing a bunch of work with both BYU Alumni Association and the HBS Alumni Association. I was doing church service. I was the Relief Society president in 2 different wards and lots of other service. My husband was the bishop for a time. And oddly enough, I love musical theater and I'm a singer, so I would do musical theater shows. I point that out just because it's nonlinear. It has nothing to do with those 2 critical questions I think about in the shower, although maybe I'm singing in the shower. So that was just kind of, I think, representative of what happens when you become a parent. And this can be if you're a man or a woman, mother, father, it doesn't matter. But children come into the picture and they can make that very linear career be a little bit less linear, because now your decisions are based on something a little different. Now you're trying to maybe, instead of solving for maximizing the effect of your career, you're now solving for wanting to make sure that you are raising good children, right? So it does throw things off a little bit. While I was doing, once my kids were a little bit older, I started volunteering in my local government and then held a bunch of different official positions there. So I was a member of the planning board. I was the chair of a big comprehensive master plan committee, which was called the Acton 2020 committee. I was the chair of the finance committee, which did all the budgeting for all the town's expenses, schools, municipal government, all that kind of thing. So I actually spent 8 years doing that. Most of the time I was not working. So it was just a time I would go and I'd leave my kids with my husband, and in the evening I'd go to lots of meetings, and then during the day when my kids were napping or so forth, I would do a lot of work, budgeting and so forth for those positions. Okay, so that was sort of phase 2. Now phase 3 is I went back to work after I'd been out for about 12 years or so. I don't say it here, but the first thing I did is I actually did a consulting gig for a nonprofit organization, which was 1 day a week, and that worked great for me. At the time, my youngest was about 2, and so it worked great for me to be able to just do a very short-term 6-month consulting gig 1 day a week. And it helped me to kind of get my feet wet again, so to speak. Then I was able to get a job at the Harvard Business School with their social enterprise initiative, which is sort of a center for all things that have to do with social enterprise, public sector, nonprofit, for-profit business with a social mission. And it was a center that I was very involved in and worked with a lot as a student. And I was brought on to figure out how to connect and engage alumni that are in the social sector and sort of create a set of programming for those folks. And it's been a great experience. It really kind of enabled me to refresh my knowledge of the social sector after having been out of that field for a long time. And that's what I'm currently doing now. However, I took a leave of absence and I decided to run for office. And the reason I decided to run is that, like I think many of us, I was becoming increasingly dismayed by the political polarization that was going on all around us. And I felt like I was qualified to run. I'd spent 8 years in my town government, and I could do it. I was somebody, not everyone can answer that political polarization with running for office, but that was something that I could do, given my situation in life. And so I decided to run for state senate in Massachusetts, really on this platform of I know how to bring people together. I've brought people together in my 8 years of town service from all different political ideologies and that sort of thing. So that's phase 3. What I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about political polarization. I'd love to get your input as well, so I'm hoping we have the time to kind of have that discussion. And then talk about how that political polarization affected my campaign, kind of as a sort of a case study. Just actually, quickly, as a raise of hands, anyone thought about running for public office someday? Raise your hand. Okay, so that's good. There's actually quite a few of you. Very good. So pay attention. Okay. All right. So here I am again. Pretty qualified candidate, 8 years in Acton town government. I've got 5 school-age kids, so schools are everything, and so I have experience there. I have, the right educational background. I have professional experience in nonprofit management, social enterprise. I have a reputation for being an inclusive, consensus-driven leader. But guess what else? I'm a Republican. Who knows what Massachusetts is like? Elizabeth, my friend from my home ward, knows what Massachusetts is like. Massachusetts is the most liberal state in the U.S., the bluest state in the U.S. So this was definitely going to be an uphill battle, right? And I knew that. But you know, I say that because otherwise, it seems like I'm pretty qualified, right? All right. So here are some strategic considerations as I thought about running. Here's a picture of me with my family. So I was running against a state senator who was a 16-year incumbent, Democrat. He was always beating his Republican opponents by about 30 points, at least. Some election cycles, he had no opponents. He was a 45-year-old single man, no kids. All his career experience was from Beacon Hill. He basically spent his whole Beacon Hill, you guys, that's the capital. So he'd basically spent his whole career being a legislator. Now, the top of the ticket in the 2018 race, we had a very popular, very bipartisan-focused Republican governor in the form of Charlie Baker, okay? And he was up for re-election. We also had, I'm sure many of you know, Elizabeth Warren, or know of her, and she was also up for re-election, okay? Senate district, 14 different communities, about 172,000 people. Suburban community, not urban at all. Mix of sort of super well-educated and affluent to a little bit less well-educated, a little bit of working class. Schools are really huge everywhere. District actually voted for Baker, Governor Baker, in 2014 when he ran the first time as a new candidate by 9 points. So even though this Democratic incumbent was winning huge over Republican opponents, Baker actually won the Senate district by 9 points. So this was kind of encouraging. He was a very moderate, bipartisan guy. So I thought, you know, maybe there is an opening for someone that fits that bill. But we also have Trump. Huge consideration. I don't know, I haven't been in Utah a ton during Trump's presidency, but in Massachusetts, he is not popular at all, okay? So that was, I knew that would be a massive overhang for our campaign, that there was going to be a reaction against really any Republican because of Trump, all right? But I also thought having Governor Baker being popular and on the top of the ticket would also really help, right? Because he represented a different kind of republicanism, he was very bipartisan, non-inflammatory, all of those types of things, a consensus builder. So that's the setup. Now I want to talk a little bit about political polarization, some of the symptoms and kind of results of political polarization. So I've populated this slide, but before I put anything on there, I want to get your input of kind of what do you see as some of the symptoms of political polarization? Any thoughts of that? Elizabeth.
Name calling of the other party, whatever the other party is. There's nicknames that
Yeah.
each party has for each other.
Sure. Yeah, and it's sort of like the personal gets blended with the political, right? You start calling your political opponent that they're actually a bad person, right? Versus being just different in ideology. Other thoughts?
Like kind of dealing in absolutes, like there's like a right way and a wrong way and no middle ground. Both sides believe that they're right.
Right. There's no common ground. Can't find it. Other thoughts? Over here.
Yeah, a lack of compromise.
Willingness to compromise, right? Political purism, you know, we're going to shut down the government because we're not going to compromise, right? Go ahead.
Where people assume that they can just tie your moral opinion, like your moral beliefs to your political opinions, and assume everything you believe just by what you're registered as.
Yes, right. So there's sort of like your party becomes a proxy for everything about you. Someone over here.
I think there's a hyper-focus on positions instead of interests. Like people will stick to these positions no matter what, instead of thinking about like, what are the underlying interests we can maybe compromise and get behind each other on.
Yes, absolutely. Great comment. And over here?
I feel like it's a good way to get votes. If you're in a democratic state and you tell everybody that we're just gonna prove we no matter what, you're gonna get votes in there. The more extreme
Very
you
interesting.
Are, the more extreme you are, the more votes you can get.
Yeah.
Towards what you're trying to
especially in the primary system, right? Especially in the primary system. Other thoughts? Okay, so let's go through some of the stuff I put on here. So some of the symptoms: increased government dysfunction, right? Shutdowns all the time, not able to compromise, right? We have high rates of incumbency, right? So political parties are controlling, essentially through the state legislatures, controlling the district lines, right? And so they gerrymander. You guys know about gerrymandering, right? And that encourages incumbency. It kind of guarantees seats. We have historic lows in our trust in government and in each other. And in fact, this was the thing that really got me in the race when I heard the statistic, how we have the lowest trust in each other, lowest trust in our fellow citizen that we've ever had. Isn't that interesting? Right? We don't trust each other because we think the other side is bad, right? We have a zero-sum game mentality, right? So we don't want to find common ground. That's compromising. We have blurring of personal, political with policy, inflammatory name calling. We talked about that. And Trump himself, his candidacy, I think actually, and his election actually is indicative of some of this political polarization and the way that he used that to be elected, right? Okay, so some causes. Now we've kind of mixed, in some of our comments, we were causes and symptoms and results. They're a little bit mixed. So I'm just going to go through these. But if you have any other thoughts, let me know what you think in terms of causes. So some of our institutions really just cause this. We have a primary election system. We talked about how that tends to elect the more ideologically extreme candidates. We have this hyper gerrymandering going on, right, where legislatures will look, now that we have so much data about voters and voting behavior, legislatures can literally carve out districts to be exactly what they want to be until they get the party, the majority of the party voters that they want, right? Social media, we know we can all get in social media bubbles and then we're not seeing other different perspectives and we're getting all of our news from only the friends that we think the same as we do. Media capture, it's hard to find a non-biased source of media. I mean, not even like they're all essentially overtly biased, right? Culture and behavior, decline in social trust. We talked about that. Political self-sorting. Now we might even move to places where we feel more comfortable politically because we want to be by people that agree with us because we just do not trust people on the other side, so to speak, right? And there's more mobility, people can do that more. So you don't even talk to people that might have different views than you because you don't encounter them. Maybe there's some of this is just the negative parts of human nature, right? Our economic system. Right now, we've had a big shift in our economy of work. Massive things that are changing. Rise in economic inequality, right? We talk about that. That's sort of all this automation that's come out of technology is taking away jobs. That's causing people to feel disenfranchised, feeling like there's no hope. They feel resentful. There's politics of resentment and contributing to this rise in economic inequality, just causing, again, that resentment. And we have this duopolistic structure. We have two political parties, that's it. I mean, we sort of have others, but not really, right? So have anyone studied monopolies, what that means? Who studied that? So this is like a monopoly, but it's a duopoly. And there are massive barriers of entry to get in to actually be a different competing political party. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about this because the party's number one goal is not great public policy. It's power, okay? That's what they're interested in. So just like you have different industries, the political system is an industry. It's a private industry that sets its own rules. And it's incentivized by power. Again, not by good policy outcomes, which means winning. And that means this whole set of people, political consultants, party operatives, special interests, donors, all of those people they're incentivized by gaining power, right? And their strongest incentive is actually to create powerful contrast. to create, they want to divide and they want to differentiate. So this guy over here was saying that they want to do that. They want to show how different they are, because that way you want to come over here and not go over there, right? And barriers of entry, which we won't go into all of that, but lots of barriers to entry that keep out the competition. So there's actually a fascinating study. Quinn, have you seen this? You got to look at this. You'll like it. By Michael Porter, who's actually a very famous business school professor at the Harvard Business School, that did this analysis, okay? So anyway, he and a colleague, Catherine Gale. So over time, the duopoly works together to set numerous rules and practices that reinforce division and enhance separation. Okay? So another big factor. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this polarization and my campaign, okay? So first of all, I was running as a member of a major political party. Part of me didn't really want to run as Republican because I was feeling a little disassociated given the party leadership, but I definitely wasn't a Democrat either. And I knew that if I didn't run as any party, nobody would even pay attention to me at all. So you have some infrastructure to work with when you run as a member of a political party, major political party. So that in of itself was a factor. I was running against an incumbent, and we talked about incumbency being one of the results of polarization. This was interesting and kind of surprising to me, working with political operatives. So I had a senior campaign advisor who was very experienced. I had a campaign manager, and I had a field director. Those people are all paid. And one of the things that I observed throughout the process is I kind of had come in very much wanting to run a very positive campaign, and I'm all about bringing people together, and that's who I am. That's what I've done. And they were actually very good people, and I think were not terribly negative people, but their incentives were not the exact same as mine. Their incentive was for me to win. My incentive was me to win, but also to maintain my integrity and my character, okay? That was not their incentive. I think this happens a ton. So one of the things, the dynamics that I was experiencing throughout my campaign was this constant kind of back and forth of like, how negative will she go sort of thing, right? So that was interesting. Social experience, this was very interesting to me. So I live in a town that's very liberal, generally speaking. Most of my friends are all very liberal, and that's fine. When I came out as a Republican, so to speak, not the people that know, but when I came out as a Republican candidate, I found that some of my friends they just couldn't even talk about it with me. Like they just couldn't even bring it up. Some of my closest friends, they were so mad at Trump, and they felt so much distrust in the other side because of that they just couldn't even say, hey, how's the campaign going? And it was so interesting to me that was so difficult for them. Even though they knew me, they knew how I was running, why I was running, the type of person I was, but that political polarization that creates those feelings of like, I just can't even go there to that other side was there. Activist versus average voter. This is interesting because one of the things that campaigns need activists. They need volunteers. And your activists almost exclusively are going to be more extreme. So not only do candidates often want to, vote, primary voters want to vote for the more extreme candidate usually, but your activists even more that you need for your campaign. They're the ones that are going to help you. They're the ones that are going to get the work done. And so if you're not appealing to them and to their causes, it's harder to recruit them, right? So this is actually a big deal, something I did not appreciate at all. And so fortunately for me, I was the only Republican in the race. So a lot of these activists, even though I was pretty moderate, they were still willing to support me. And my opponent was so extreme, they were like, great, But it was an interesting dynamic, and it makes you realize why candidates often tack to the more ideological extremes, not just because of the primary voters, but because of the people that they need to help them. The contrasting messaging, this was really hard for me. To some degree, you have to be able to show how you're different. And is that negative? Maybe it is, right? And how do you draw the line with negative versus character assassination? This was tough. The debates, this is a picture of me with debating my opponent. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I did a couple of debates. I was very nervous about them. And I had prepared pretty well. The first couple of questions on the first debate, though, were not really ideological questions. And I happened to agree with my opponent. He gave an answer, and I sort of said, well, I actually agree, you know? And after the first couple times I did that, and one of the things that they train you to do in business school is you're always trying to figure out that common ground, right? Like, I want to build on that point. That was a great point. Now I want to give it another perspective, but I really appreciate that point. So I found myself starting to do that in the debate, which does not work for the debate. People that are watching the debate want to see how you're different, right? So after the first couple of responses, I was like, okay, I got to switch tactics. I can't do this anymore. And so I did. But it was interesting because my instincts were to not want to contrast how different I was. Because my instincts are trying to find common ground, right? A little more about my campaign. Here's Elizabeth's brother, actually. Elizabeth is from my home ward. So I personally knocked over 6,000 doors to meet voters in their homes. I had other volunteers knock another 12,000. I attended nearly 150 community and campaign events throughout the 14 communities. I met with dozens of different community leaders. I visited multiple senior centers, schools, businesses. We had very strong advertising, lots of targeted mailers, Facebook ads, all of this. This is all to say it was a very active campaign. People that had run against my opponent before hadn't really been particularly active. I had some really encouraging feedback. I raised about $150,000, which was far and above what anyone usually raises for these kinds of races, especially when you're running as a Republican against an incumbent. Far and away more. I received over 30 endorsements from municipal leaders from across the district, which was highly unusual running against an incumbent, because usually municipal leaders, city council members, so forth, they don't want to go against the incumbent, right? But they endorsed me. I was named one of the 6 women to watch in Massachusetts politics by our local NPR station. Here's some quotes my opponent said, I have the strongest opponent I've ever had. So I guess that was good feedback for me. A Republican activist said, you're my most favorite candidate. A Democratic voter said, you'll be the first Republican I've ever voted for. So it was a lot of that, right? I was getting a lot of Democrats donated to my campaign, a lot of Democrats voted for me, were very excited about my campaign, and so forth, which I needed. I had to get Democrats to vote for me, so I would never win. Really bad results. Shockingly bad results. 30 points I lost by. And I was truly shocked. I had a poll that put me within 10 points about 2 months out, kind of before the major phase of the campaign. So I was optimistic that we would, if not win, come close. I knew it was going to be hard to win as a first-time candidate. Shockingly bad. So I'll talk a little bit about why I lost. Trump was the elephant in the room that I never wanted to mention because I was a state senate candidate. I wanted the focus to be on the state senate candidate, but it just didn't matter because the election was all about Trump. It just was. And as much as I tried to control that, it just was. Also, related to that, there was, you guys observed, a massive blue wave, particularly in Massachusetts. So usually a political advisor's, their what's the word I'm looking for? Their rule that is never, what's the word I'm looking for? They always know that if people don't vote, they don't vote. So you never go after voters that don't vote. You never go after people that don't vote. And you do this very targeted, you have all this data, you figure out who votes in midterm elections, and that's who you go after based on political party affiliation and behavior and all this kind of stuff. So that's like the number one rule for political advisors. Well, that turned out to be totally wrong. So we were anticipating about 60 to 62,000 people that were going to vote in my district. It turned out 72,000 voted. And all of those people, all of those extra people that came to vote, they weren't voting for anything that was interesting on the ballot. We had two incumbents. We had a governor and a senator, as I said before, that were running on the top of the ticket that were shoo-ins. They were ahead by 40 points. So there was nothing interesting. So all of those extra voters came for one reason, and that was Trump. They were mad at Trump. So that meant they were voting straight blue. Unfortunately, Governor Baker, who I thought would be very helpful, and I was told was going to be very helpful, and that he hated my opponent, and he couldn't stand working with him, and yeah, he was so excited by my candidacy, chose total caution throughout the election. So he was worried about his own reelection, even though he distanced himself from Trump. He didn't want to be associated with any Republican in the whole state. So as it turned out, he didn't help anyone. So every single Republican had crazily dismal results. It wasn't just me, except him. He won. And then there were a lot of disillusioned Republicans that didn't come out to vote, A, because they either were frustrated with Trump, or B, because they actually were frustrated with Governor Baker. If they were Trump supporters, they were frustrated with Governor Baker because he was distancing himself from Trump. So those voters didn't come out. Other factors. Incumbency is really an advantage and something I just didn't fully appreciate. But when you're incumbent, you have made all these connections, you've done political favors, you're entangled with all sorts of different groups and people. And the longer you're incumbent, it's harder to beat you. Even though there's always a sense of, oh, anti-incumbent and stuff like that, but the reality is incumbents have connections they've cultivated. And you know, the reality is the general political metrics of the region, even though I was sort of pinning my hopes on the fact that Governor Baker had won by 9 percentage points in 2014, it was still a very blue district. And my opponent was beating Republican opponents by 30 plus points. Down ticket race was a huge factor that I didn't appreciate as much. Because I was running for the Massachusetts State Senate and not a higher profile race, it was very hard to sort of get my message out. There was no clear platform. There's sort of local news, which nobody really reads. It's not a high enough profile race to make the more regional news. And so it's much easier just to use the political party affiliation as a proxy, right? Just a proxy. So you vote blue. You vote blue. And you know, even maybe I received a flyer from this person. She seems kind of cool, but you know, I'm just going straight blue. And that's kind of what's happened. So it's fundamentally just, but yet the Senate district was big enough that it was really hard to reach a significant amount of voters personally. So it was kind of like not high profile enough to really get any news attention for people to pay attention, but it was also not small enough to really be able to do the, you know, make a significant dent in the kind of retail politicking like this. Hi, I'm Margaret Busse, I'm running for state senate. Which it turns out I'm really good at, because I did it a lot. And you know, again, this unwillingness to kind of go super negative and inflammatory, I just couldn't do it. And at one point, you know, my campaign advisor said, well, when one has to choose to do well in order to do good, right? Sometimes, you know, you have to use the ends to justify your means, right? I want to be a good politician, but in order to get there, I have to like be really bad. Well, something's really failed in the system. That's how it works, right? I'm so glad I didn't go down that path, though, because I did provide contrast, but I really avoided the character assassination stuff and the inflammatory stuff, even though in some ways my opponent was sort of, you know, low-hanging fruit because he was very, very extreme. Because the thing is, given the blue wave, it wouldn't have mattered. I could never have won no matter what. It just never would have happened given how many people turned out to vote. So I'm very grateful I did not make that choice. So here are just some food for thought as we kind of wrap up. Here are some possible solutions. And maybe you guys have talked about some of these things. I'd love you guys to raise your hands if you have other ideas. One other thing we have to do better is we have to incentivize moderation and provide support and funds to moderate candidates and provide a home for them. There's actually a lot of organizations that have cropped up more recently, really actually after the Trump election or because of the Trump election, that are trying to do just that. I'm a member of an organization called Leadership Now, which is founded by a friend of mine from business school who felt really passionately about getting more business leadership and moderation into politics. And there's actually a lot of organizations that have cropped up. We need to shift some of our electoral systems. So we need bipartisan districting commissions so we get rid of the gerrymandering. I'm sure you guys have heard of that. Ranked choice voting, I won't go into that, but I think that's actually a way that we can get more moderate candidates. I think it's been used in Maine to that effect. Nonpartisan blanket primary. California now has these jungle primaries where they just take the top 2 people, 2 vote getters. It's not like one from one party and one from another party. Fundraising. Democratizing fundraising. Funds are obviously huge for candidates. Money is huge for candidates. And if you have to play to some extreme base to try to raise money, then you're going to have to go extreme. But if you can democratize it, a friend of mine who also went to HBS started something called Crowd Pack, which has actually been a very effective way for candidates to get money from regular people. Giselle Cortesani is her name. I don't know, but she did have a co-founder, so it might be. Oh, no kidding. No kidding. Just increasing transparency in fundraising, promoting political philanthropy. Now people are starting to talk about, I want to invest in good government. And I'm willing to put my money behind candidates that I think are going to give us good government, and they see it as an investment or a philanthropic donation rather than like a political contribution. And then I think this last one's important. We have to all be aware of our own personal behavior, right? We need to seek first to understand people's different views. We have to really force ourselves to get outside of our ideological bubbles. And we need to recognize when the political has crossed over into the personal. I think it happens all the time now, and it's almost becoming, you don't even realize it, right? So those are some thoughts that I have about that. Any other thoughts that you guys have about solutions to political polarization? Yeah, no ideas. This is the problem, right? It's really hard. How about you?
This is more of a question.
Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned how when you're going through the debate process, you started off by using text in the business school from, recognizing the side, building upon it, common ground. Then you switched tactics to the opposite of making sure that you were standing out. If you wanted to build like a more moderate system, wouldn't you want to use the former way of debating versus the latter?
Yeah, I do. I just didn't think it was going to be effective for the audience, right?
Okay.
And that was what was hard. And to some degree, people are there to see specifically what your contrast is. And you can still be pleasant. I was not unpleasant, and I was not mean. I was just I have a different point of view. And I think that's okay, right? And to some degree, you have to point out contrast, but you can do it in a way that is not, excuse me, name-calling, not inflammatory, right? And then I think in the actual crafting of policy, that's when you really focus on your common ground. Like let's focus on the common ground as our starting place and build from there, right? Excuse me. Oh yeah, hand wringing is not enough, right? Hand wringing. I'm so mad. I'm so frustrated. You got to do something, Jamin.
I'm experiencing the current political moment as the opposite of what political crossing over to personal. It's actually personal crossing over into political, which is
Yes.
to say, and that's a really hard thing for me to figure out. I feel like I could do okay at not letting the political cross over to personal, but I'm having a really hard time not allowing the personal, my kind of personal distaste for political candidates, political leaders, not make everything.
Yeah. Like all Republicans are horrible because we don't like Trump.
Yeah, or
That's an example.
Or I may not even go. I don't know that I go that far, but it is as far as saying I can't stand. Personally, I can't stand who Trump is. Therefore, I have a really hard time even wanting to explore the possibility that any policy that comes out of,
Yes.
out of his leadership might be
Right.
okay.
Right, and there's some policies that I like and agree with, but it's like, you're right, it just,
But I
it's like
can't-
becomes tainted by the
I
personal.
can't do that.
Yeah.
So that's a really
That's an
tricky
interesting,
thing
yeah, that's really interesting.
for me
David.
to navigate right now. I don't,
Yeah,
I haven't figured out how to do it.
yeah, that's very interesting. The opposite is very hard. Yeah,
But what you're saying is interesting, is that the duopoly, I mean, in my experience, he's the most extreme version of that.
mhm.
But it feels like we're hitting a phase where our duopoly is producing that.
Yes, exactly.
Where the personal become, it's impossible to separate personal from.
Yeah, well, especially, I think, yeah, there's kind of been a cult of personality a little bit with the party. And that's why when I said, what are some of the results of political polarization? Well, Trump himself as a candidate, right? Okay. So here's some concluding thoughts that'll hopefully kind of wrap all these different thoughts together, because I know I had kind of two parts of my presentation. So as I've talked about, I've done a lot of different things: family, career, church service, community service. I think all of these can and should be in the service of God, right? Now, you guys are an audience, I can say that which I like that about BYU. And I think in some ways my whole life has been trying to figure out what is the way that God wants me to serve him through all these different things. And it's not just one thing. It's not just family. It's not just career. It's not just church service. And it's not just community service. It's actually all of them in some way, right? But making it all work is tough, right? And it requires faithfulness. It requires flexibility. It requires creativity. How am I going to fit all this in? It requires hard work. There's a lot of hard work, actually. And it requires spousal support. My husband's back there in the back here. That's something that, as either a woman or a man, when you're married, you have to be cognizant of this, right? You have to be willing to support your spouse in as she or he is trying to do this, and hopefully he or she will support you when you're trying to do it as well. It's incredibly important. When you have that partnership and that kind of agreement to do it, it becomes much easier. Balancing optimism, conviction, passion with realism. And I actually think this point is sort of relevant to both the first part of my presentation and balancing all this stuff, and the second part, which is that I generally am a pretty realistic person, but I also am a person that has a lot of convictions and a lot of passion, and I want to do all this and that and the other. And that can be a little crazy. So in trying to do all these things on the top, family, career, church service, community service, it can be hard. And sometimes you have to just be a little bit realistic about what you can accomplish in any given day or, any given month or year. Similarly, I think I had a strong conviction about running for office and being a different, model of a different kind of Republican and a different kind of candidate. And maybe didn't have enough grounding in realism about what might happen. Having said that, I still lost. I lost, and losing is really hard. But I think it was still valuable to give voters a choice. And I actually had many people come up to me and say, "I'm so glad I had a good choice to make." So many times people feel like there was nobody I wanted to vote for, right? So I felt like I did give voters a good choice. And I got to contribute ideas to the public square. My ideas about, I ran on a platform of, great schools, strong communities, great jobs. I got to contribute my ideas about those policy issues to the public square. Excuse me. And then finally, going back to our political polarization, whether candidate or citizen, we really all have a responsibility to engage, first of all. We really all have a responsibility to engage, right? So the answer to political polarization is not to say, I'm not engaging. I just can't handle it. It's too much. So we have a responsibility to engage, but we have a responsibility to engage in respectful debate that uplifts our democracy, right? So those three things: engage respectfully in a way that uplifts our democracy. I know as members of the church, we really do believe that our Constitution was inspired and that the formation of this country was inspired. And we need to, as members of the church, I feel it's our obligation to uplift our democracy. And I think these are some ways to do it. So that's the end of my thoughts. Would love to have questions. Yeah. Are we out of
at the
town?
end, so
Oh, okay.
why don't we end, but then if you have questions,
Oh, great.
you can come up and engage.
I'm sorry, I thought we were going to the hour,
Yeah,
but
that's
sorry
fine.
about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
So yeah, please come
thank
up and talk or ask questions or
Would you
whatever.
join me in thanking Margaret?